Have you ever stopped to think about why some animes leave such a heavy trail of blood that you end up sitting in front of the screen not knowing whether to laugh or stay in shock? That strange, almost uncomfortable feeling of watching something brutal and still not being able to look away. Yeah, Dorohedoro is exactly that. And the second season, which arrived on April 1st, 2026, after 6 long years of waiting, was like opening a door you already knew had something ugly behind it, and opening it anyway. Today we're going to talk about why this anime got even more violent in its second season, and more importantly, why all that violence isn't gratuitous. Stay with me, because there's a lot going on beneath the surface here. First things first, take a breath, because this isn't for people who want shallow analysis. This is for people who sense that Dorohedoro is saying something most anime are too afraid to say. Let's start from the beginning. Dorohedoro came from Q Hayashi's manga, originally published back in 2000 and finished in 2018. 23 volumes, 18 years of an author building a universe where everything is rotten. Everything smells of rubble, blood, and magic smoke. MAPPA adapted the first season in 2020 and delivered something nobody expected, an anime that blended CGI with traditional animation in a way that was chaotic and yet absurdly coherent with the tone of the source material. It wasn't perfect, but it was authentic. It was dirty in exactly the right way. And then came the silence. 6 years. An entire generation of fans growing up while waiting for answers. Who is Caiman really? What lives inside his mouth? What do the cross-eyes actually want? Why does Nikaido hide her own magic? When the official website confirmed in February 2026 that the second season would premiere on April 1st with a global simultaneous release through Crunchyroll and Netflix with the same director Yuichiro Hayashi and the same studio MAPPA, the community's reaction was that specific mix of relief and dread. Because Dorohedoro is not an anime that holds your hand. It throws you into the hole, literally the name of the city where everything happens, and tells you, figure it out. The hole is that kind of place, a miserable, dark city where sorcerers snatch ordinary residents off the street to use as guinea pigs for atrocious magic experiments. Imagine an entire population that exists only to serve as test subjects for an elite. That's not just science fiction or dark fantasy. That's a metaphor anyone who has ever felt disposable understands in their bones. Caiman wakes up in this world with no memory, a reptile head, immunity to magic, and starts swallowing sorcerers. Literally, he puts their heads inside his mouth, lets a mysterious figure that lives inside his throat identify each one, and kills the ones who aren't responsible for the curse. It's grotesque, it's violent, and it's the most existential question an anime can ask. What would you do if you didn't know who you were, but knew someone had destroyed whoever you used to be? That's Dorohedoro, and that's why the violence isn't decoration, it's the language of the universe. But let's get specific, because Dorohedoro S2 arrived with director Hayashi making a promise that put fans on full alert. In an interview released through official channels before the premiere, he said the new season would be even more chaotic, anarchic, and violent than the first one, and that this was intentional, a deliberate creative choice. To understand what that means, put yourself in the shoes of someone who adapted the first season knowing they were laying the foundation for something far bigger. The first season is almost an introduction. You learn the rules of the whole, meet Caiman and Nikaido, watch N and his family of sorcerers function as the main antagonists. The violence was already there, of course. Bodies transformed into mushrooms, limbs torn off, fights where characters keep walking after damage that would kill any normal human being. But it was a kind of violence you could still file under action fantasy. The second season shifts the register entirely, and it shifts it for one very specific narrative reason: the cross-eyes. If in the first season, Anne was the antagonist with a defined shape, elegant suits, and almost corporate power, the cross-eyes are absolute chaos. They're a group born from the resentment of people who were discarded by sorcerers, a gang of people from the whole that watched children abandoned in a lethal reign of magic and who built an organization around a single man named Kai, rooted in collective hatred and violence as a response to the world. And here's the detail that changes everything. Kai is not an anime villain. He's a physical manifestation of collective trauma. His story begins with a child who wanted to escape the hole, who tried to become a sorcerer, who went through experiments conducted by Professor Kascube and completely lost his own identity in the process. The hole literally rebuilt who he was. Kai was born, and Kai functions as an extension of the hatred the hole had accumulated against sorcerers across centuries. What the second season deepens in its most recent episodes is the heart of the narrative. The Cross-Side's violence isn't random. It has an address, it has a cause, and it has a very specific cruelty that goes beyond gang warfare. Actually, pause on whatever scene is playing in your head right now. That level of violence that makes you hold your breath not because it's spectacular, but because you understand where it comes from. That's what sets Dorohedoro apart from any other seinen that uses blood as a product. Two new characters that the second season confirmed in the March 2026 trailer left the community especially curious. Dokuga and Tetsuo, two central Cross-Sides members, voiced by Koki Uchiyama and Daiki Hamano respectively. They bring layers to the organization that the first season only hinted at, and with them, the emotional dimension of the Cross-Sides becomes much harder to ignore. Because Dokuga and Tetsuo aren't just muscle, they're representatives of people that the society of the whole threw away. And when you understand that, watching their violent scenes shifts in tone completely. But it's not just the Cross-Sides that make the second season hit harder. Episode 6, which became informally known in the community as Caiman's face reveal, delivers one of the most anticipated scenes in the entire work. Caiman's human face. Nikaido finally sees who he is, but the timing is cruel, the way Dorohedoro knows how to be cruel. Because at that moment, when the revelation finally arrives, everything around it is already falling apart. And episode 7 delivers Aikawa, one of the identities inhabiting Caiman, taking control of the body and confronting En at the mansion. The fight is drawn as a desperate confrontation, and En comes out torn apart, not defeated, torn apart. The difference matters in Dorohedoro because, as any fan of the series knows, death is rarely permanent here. The mushroom Kikurage is still circulating, and the universe has its own rules about what comes back and what doesn't. Alright, but here's the question that keeps pulsing from the very beginning. Why did the second season need to be more violent? Wouldn't it have been enough to maintain the same level as the first? The answer lies in the structure of Q Hayashida's narrative, and it's smarter than it first appears. The first season establishes a world where violence is normalized. The whole operates on a logic where bodies are disposable, where sorcerers' magic transforms human beings into unconsenting experiments, where the only currency the residents of the whole possess is their own physical endurance. In that context, Caiman's violence, swallowing sorcerers, is almost defensive. It's the only language the world around him understands. But the second season begins in rupture. The rotten equilibrium that existed in the first, even violent as it was, it had a structure, starts to give way. The Cross-Eyes advance. En is in a state he's never been in before, and Caiman is fractured between at least 3 different identities: the Caiman we've been following, Aikikawa, and the fragments of Kai that still persist. When you have a protagonist who literally doesn't know who he is, and you place him in a world that's falling apart, the violence doesn't increase by accident. It increases because the fiction is being honest about what happens when power structures collapse. There's no negotiation, there's no diplomacy. There's direct, brutal confrontation with no guarantee the right side survives. And here's the point that most Dorohedoro analyses get wrong through excessive caution. The series doesn't romanticize violence, it documents it. There's an enormous difference between an anime that puts blood on screen to seem mature and an anime that uses violence as the historical record of a world where no non-violent alternative exists. Q Hayashida spent 18 years building that argument in the manga. MAPPA is spending the entire second season reinforcing it in the anime. And director Hayashi understands this clearly enough to publicly declare that the new season was deliberately more intense. There's also a technical dimension worth mentioning. MAPPA returned with the combination of CGI and traditional animation that defined the first season, but with 6 more years of experience. The complete creative team came back. Hiroshi Seko on the scripts, Tomohiro Kishi on character design, the musical group KNOW Name on the soundtrack. The second season's opening theme, Zettai Mustan Men, has already been released and is exactly what the universe called for. Heavy, irregular, with a musical texture that sounds like it was recorded in the same filthy place where Caiman and Nikaido spend their days trying to survive. The soundtrack in Dorohedoro has always done something very few animes manage to pull off. KNOW name doesn't compose music for anime, they compose music that is part of the environment. Every track from the first season sounded like it was recorded in the hole, not in a studio. And with the second season, the promise is that this marriage between sound and image will only deepen. Let me give you a concrete example of how that affects the experience. In the first season, the scenes featuring Shin and Noi, An's duo of mass assassins, already had an almost hypnotic quality to their violence. Shin with the hammer, Noi with physical strength that defies any normal power scale. But what made those scenes disturbing wasn't the amount of damage, it was the silence between them, the efficiency without pleasure, the feeling that for them, destroying a body was as natural as breathing. The second season confirms the return of the same voice actors for Shin and Noi, and as the narrative advances, the relationship between them, which in the first season was one of the few genuinely emotional bonds in the series, will be tested in ways the manga built carefully. Because Dorohedoro has always been a work that places characters you genuinely care about in situations where there's no comfortable choice. Let's close this with what actually matters. What Dorohedoro S2 says about the kind of story we're willing to tell and to watch in 2026. We're in an era where the anime industry has delivered season after season of works that promise violence and depth, but end up pulling back at the last moment before facing their own narrative consequences. Characters who should die survive because they're popular. Arcs that should carry emotional weight get resolved with convenient power-ups. The violence is there, but it always stays at the level of safe spectacle. Dorohedoro does the opposite, and that's rare enough to deserve attention. The second season, with 11 confirmed episodes and a finale set for the end of May 2026, is building an arc that goes directly to the most disturbing core of the work. Who Caiman really is, what happens when you discover that the person you've been searching for your entire life is yourself, and what the emotional cost of an identity that was destroyed and rebuilt by an entire world's hatred. This is violence as narrative, not as product, and the difference matters. Nikaido weakened, En torn apart, the cross eyes advancing, Caiman fractured between Aikikawa and the fragments of Kai. The season is doing exactly what Q Hayashida did for 18 years in the manga, refusing to resolve the central problems conveniently, leaving the characters in the chaos they've earned, being honest about the fact that in a world like the whole, where centuries of exploitation created the level of hatred that created the cross eyes and that turned a child into Kai, there is no clean ending. And that's the reason the second season needed to be more violent, not for aesthetics, because the narrative reached the point where the emotional cost of everything that came before finally has to be paid. And in Dorohedoro, that payment has a face, has blood, and has weight. 6 years of waiting for the second season, 11 episodes releasing week by week, with the first 3 already available since April 1st. And the question the anime leaves deliberately open, one that came directly from Hayashida's manga, and that no analysis video will ever be able to resolve for you. When you discover that the monster you've spent your whole life hunting is a version of yourself that was born from the worst the world ever did to you, do you fight that version, or do you finally understand it?